I'm Father Gray, and this is a St. Mary's Minute. Last week, we began talking about how heaven appears. This is an idea that needs some explanation, specifically how it appears in the book of Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel describes at the beginning of the prophecy a heavenly vision, but the real crescendo of this happens near the end, chapters 40 and to the end of the book. And the vast majority of that time that he spends talking about heaven is about the temple and all the really boring things about the temple. So this is one of those times when it's perfectly acceptable to say that Scripture is dense and it's a lot to take in, because he goes very meticulously through this vision he has about the size of this room, of that room, of this direction of the gate, of this gate which is not to be used for a certain reason, about how all of these things work together and what it all means is kind of left out. What it means is something which is a bit more complicated than simply talking about the description of a temple. So what happens at the end of the book of the prophet Ezekiel is a vision of Jerusalem, a new Jerusalem, heavenly Jerusalem, a perfect Jerusalem. And the idea of this new Jerusalem is one that has as its heart this vast section just dedicated to the temple. What it means is that this new Jerusalem, this image of heaven, this model of heaven, is one that requires the worship of God, where the worship of God is properly understood. When we worship God for the sake of atoning for sins, for the sake of being assisted by God through grace. We do these things with an understanding of ourselves, rather importantly in this, and not just for the glory of God, because the worship of God is a worthwhile thing in itself. Now, here's the thing. Here's the difference. This distance between the worship of God that we offer, that we then get something out of, and also the worship of God that we offer, which is simply because we're participating with God in his heavenly life, is the distance between an earthly life and a heavenly life. Our lives as Christians should be molded more and more always to the worship of God because it is worthy of God. So those things about our prayer life, about our life of trying to be pleasing to God, all those kinds of things, our moral life, that which is actually our worship of God should be more and more heavenly, I think. This is something which is worthwhile and it matters. And this kind of life, this kind of motive is one that is completely not self-serving. In heaven, the saints are most certainly individuals. Individuality does not go away. However, that which is an individualism regarding why we act in faith, why we observe these things, why we even have a love of God, does go away. Our love of God should be really pure, should be really simply because it is the right thing, and not because we're trying to get something out of it. As we continue through this series on heaven, we'll talk more about other aspects of this. So, this week, let's think about two things. Heaven is a place where God is worshipped, and that worship of God is because of God alone and nothing else. Take this to heart and enjoy thinking about this. Open up the last part of the book of the prophet Ezekiel and read through that. It might be a little, pedantic, but it's also a beautiful description of something which is, in itself, beautiful.